Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee, and a large crowd followed him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish feast of Passover was near. When Jesus raised his eyes and saw that a large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" He said this to test him, because he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good are these for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people recline." Now there was a great deal of grass in that place, so the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed them to those who were reclining, and also as much of the fish as they wanted. When they had had their fill, he said to his disciples, "Gather the fragments left over, so that nothing will be wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets with fragments, and the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. When the people saw the sign he had done, they said, "This is truly the prophet, the one who is to come into the world." Since Jesus knew that they were going to come and carry him off to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain alone. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
It's kind of quiet this morning, isn't it? A little quiet, peaceful. It's nice every now and again to have rainy Sunday mornings like that. And, if you feel like you might be falling asleep or something like that, just consider it recompense from God to me for all the times that I didn't pay attention when I was at Mass. When I was younger. I was thinking, leading up to this weekend, I was thinking about something I did when, I really can't remember how old I was. I don't know if I was in middle school or high school, but I was at Mass, and I was there with my aunt and my uncle, and my cousin was sitting next to me, and I had this idea that during communion, I was going to receive the host, and then I was going to dip the host into the chalice. Right? Maybe some of you have seen that before. How many of you have seen that before? All right, not a good thing to do, all right, just in case you're wondering. It's not allowed, okay? But anyway, I didn't realize that, and I had seen some other people do it, and I went up for communion, and I stuck the host in the chalice, and when I got back to my pew, I was really proud of myself, for being brave and doing something different, and sure enough, my uncle just tore into me when I got back to my pew, and just chewed me out, right, completely. And I remember when he was, rebuking me for doing this, I remember I was just really surprised, and I was really shocked, right, that he would be so upset with me. And I remember when I was sitting in the pew and he was rebuking me like this, I remember I said, "What's the big deal? What's the big deal? What's the big deal?" And I was thinking about that this weekend, because for the next 5 weeks in the church, we are going to be hearing from the Gospel of John, right, chapter 6, and during the Gospel for these next 5 weeks. So every 3 years, the church asks us to listen to this sermon from Jesus, from John chapter 6. It's a sermon that Jesus gave all about the Eucharist. And I remember when it changed for me, when I realized everything was different about the Eucharist. It was when I was on a retreat when I was in high school. I was at a retreat called Destination Jesus. And it was February 16th, it was 2007. I was a junior in high school. And at this retreat, they did something called Eucharistic Adoration, which I know many of you are familiar with because we do here at our parish every Wednesday before our weekend masses. We take the Eucharist out of the tabernacle, place the Eucharist in a golden monstrance, and Jesus is placed on the altar, right, for people to pray. And despite being Catholic my whole life, I had never experienced Eucharistic Adoration. And And that night, during Eucharistic adoration, the key speaker, right, the keynote speaker of the night, he talked about this sermon from John chapter 6. And he explained that Jesus was very explicit in his sermon, that as Moses gave manna to the people of Israel, so God would give this new bread from heaven. And the new bread was Jesus' flesh for the life of the world. And that so many people, when they heard this, they didn't understand. He said, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? And many of them began to think that he was crazy, that he had gone mad. Jesus had this huge following of disciples. And after he preached this, many of his disciples actually decided to stop following him because they were confused. And I remember the keynote speaker describing this in this retreat. And he said, Jesus meant what he said. He meant what he said about the Eucharist. That he really would give us his flesh to eat, his blood to drink. And he meant it so much so that he let most of his disciples leave and stop following him for that teaching. Many people, when they read about this sermon, they think, well, maybe the people just misunderstood, and maybe, Jesus was just being symbolic. But when Jesus was teaching people while he was here on earth, when people misunderstood what Jesus was saying, typically he corrected them. He said, no, you're not understanding. Like you might remember the story of Nicodemus, right? When Jesus said that in order to enter into the kingdom of heaven, you have to be born again. And Nicodemus said, are you saying that I have to go back into my mother's womb? Jesus said, no, I'm talking about being born of water and spirit, baptism. He didn't do that when he gave his famous sermon about the Eucharist. He let those disciples leave because he wanted it to be absolutely clear that he meant what he said. And I remember at that retreat on February 16th, 2007, in front of the Eucharist, hearing these words, I remember it was like for the very first time in my whole life, even though I've been Catholic my entire childhood, I finally understood. Jesus is really there on the altar. Jesus is really there every time we have Mass. That the Lord of the universe comes among us. It changed everything for me. I realized that my life could never be the same. And I think back now to, that time where I was in middle school or high school or whatever, my uncle was rebuking me. And I think, man, how right he was. Think about the lack of reverence I was showing to communion. I was treating communion as if it was just an ordinary piece of bread, ordinary wine. No different from any other food I'd ever eat. Instead of realizing it was the Lord of the universe that had come to me in communion. I was thinking about that again this weekend, and I was thinking about something else I learned when I went to seminary, and some of these things started to make sense for me. I remember I had to take a psychology class in seminary, and I learned about this idea called cognitive dissonance. How many of you have heard of cognitive dissonance? Right? Patty, can you give a definition to everybody? Cognitive dissonance is based on this idea that someone believes something or is told to believe something, but all of their actions in their life or the actions of other people demonstrate the opposite of what that person believes. And over the course of time, no matter how strong that person's belief is, if their actions do not reflect it, they stop believing that belief. That's cognitive dissonance. And I remember learning about that in seminary. I thought, maybe that's why I went all those years as a Catholic without understanding the Church's teaching about the Eucharist. It wasn't that I had bad catechists or that I had bad teachers, but I think it was that when I would go to Mass, when I would go to church, people might have claimed that belief in the Eucharist, but it didn't actually manifest itself in their actions. I saw many people who treated the Eucharist as just any other piece of bread. And that affected my own belief. And I imagine if all of us think about that, we can probably imagine that that probably is the case. Statistics say that among Catholics, about 70% of church-going Catholics don't actually believe in the Eucharist. Or they don't understand the church's teaching. They think it's just symbolic. Maybe even some of us in the church this morning, we feel that way. And no matter how many times a priest might tell us otherwise, we still just don't believe it. Because the actions we see are not coherent with that belief. And I remember another thing I learned when I was in seminary. We were going through the catechism, and we learned about this phrase in the catechism. It's called lex orandi, lex credendi. It's a Latin phrase. It basically just means how we pray affects how we believe. And so what it means is that the way that the Mass is celebrated in the church will affect how much people believe about the Mass, about the Eucharist. Make sense? Again, it's that cognitive dissonance. Now again, I was thinking about that all this weekend as we were preparing to go through this sermon of Jesus about the Eucharist. And I thought that was something that would be very beneficial for all of us to think about. Do our actions about the Eucharist and about the Mass, are they actually coherent with what the church teaches about the Mass and about the Eucharist? The way we approach communion, does it actually reflect somebody who really believes in the Eucharist, that God is really there? Something for all of us to think about. And I think it's also important for us to recognize that this is part of the reason why so many of the things we do in the church that seem strange or seem weird to people, it's important that we do them. Because the way we pray will affect people's belief. And I'll give you some examples. You know, when I was coming of age and I was going to Catholic church, right, one of the things that I think was a mistake is that many churches I went to, do you know where the tabernacle was? I'll give you a hint, it wasn't in the center of the church. Many churches I would go to, the tabernacle was like off in some side corner of the church somewhere where people could hardly even see it. Is that manifesting a real belief in the Eucharist? The absolute center point of our church should be the tabernacle. It belongs in the center of the church. Think about other ways that churches are constructed or built. I love how here at St. Bernard, I love that we made a point to have pews in our church. You know, sometimes pews might not actually be as helpful because you can't fit as many people in a pew as you might be able to fit in chairs. But again, it's a way of manifesting to people that we're not here to see a concert. We're not here to see a show. Our church doesn't look like an auditorium. It looks like a church. Because we're in the house of God. Think about the things that we do when we're at Mass as a church. Sometimes people think it's a little strange that we chant so many parts of the Mass, for example. Why do we chant parts of the Mass instead of simply reciting them prayerfully? Because when we come to Mass, we are participating in the liturgy that goes on always in heaven. And when the angels are worshiping God, they are singing praise. And so we join in with their singing. The song of the angels in heaven. That's why we chant so many parts of Mass. Why do I have so many altar servers at Mass? Is it because all of them are really important? I need every single one of them to do something? No. It's because the Mass is a reflection that God's heavenly army in heaven meets God's earthly army here on earth. And so seeing all these altar servers processing should remind us of God's army. And why do we use incense? Same reason. Incense represents all of our prayers rising up to heaven. Everything we do is intentional. It teaches us about what we believe. The way the church is constructed and built, the way the liturgy is done. We also need to be considering, how do we ourselves personally, how do you personally approach the Mass, Eucharist? Is it fostering actions that manifest your belief in the Eucharist? And I've told you guys many times that when I was in seminary, we had a rule that nobody was allowed to talk about the Mass until at least an hour after it was over. And the rector did that because he was tired of seminarians complaining about the homily or the songs or whatever. You just received the Lord of the universe. How can you complain about anything? So are you somebody who complains about the Mass instead of being overwhelmed with gratitude? Think about when you come forward for communion. Are you in a hurry? Are you checking your watch, wondering, man, how long is this communion going to take? Or do you come forward with reverence, solemnity? Some people bow. Some people even genuflect on their way to receiving communion. Some people receive communion in the hands, and are you receiving it with reverence? Well, the Church Father says that we should make our hands like a throne when we receive God. Receiving the Lord of the universe. Some people don't even feel like their hands are worthy enough to do that, so they receive on the tongue. Again, perfectly good practice. Any way that we can outwardly manifest the fact that God is really there. When you come to Mass, do you take the time to come early, if possible, to spend some time in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament, preparing your heart and your mind to receive communion? How do you dress when you come to Mass? I'm not saying that everybody needs to wear like a shirt and tie or anything like that, but we should be dressed differently for Mass than we would for a baseball game or something like that. Showing honor to God who comes among us. Does the time that you give to God reflect your belief in the Eucharist? Is your Sunday Mass attendance the most important appointment of your entire week? And you let nothing get in the way of it? Because you can let nothing get in the way of your relationship with God. Do you seek times out throughout the rest of the week to come to Eucharistic adoration or to spend time in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel? If God, the most important person in the world, is really among us in the Eucharist, how could we go weeks and weeks without spending any time outside of Mass? Some people even come to daily Mass throughout the week. Again, recognizing the importance of the Mass. Here at St. Bernard, we're actually about to change our daily Mass schedule to allow for more people to be able to come to Mass. We're going to add a Mass on Fridays, and we're going to make an evening Mass on Tuesday evenings. All these ways trying to foster greater devotion to the Eucharist. You know, I say all these things, and I hope you don't think that I'm being judgmental or condescending or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm speaking to myself too. Sometimes I can approach the Eucharist without enough reverence. But the point remains, one of the reasons why so many Catholics, they don't believe in the Eucharist. Why so many non-Catholics, they don't really believe us when we tell them what the Eucharist is. It's because of that cognitive dissonance. Our actions are not reflecting what we believe. And so it's good for all of us to reflect on that. How can I be more reverent? How can I be more devoted? How can my actions give greater witness to this belief in the Eucharist?